The plane on which War Secretary Pete Hegseth was on had an emergency while flying back to the United States. They were over the Atlantic Ocean when the incident took place and were forced to turn around and land in the UK. This map shows where the plane was before it turned around to land in the UK. According to Flight Radar 24, the plane suddenly lost altitude and dropped down to only 10,000 feet. It's not clear yet what caused the sudden drop. According to the Department of War, the plane made an unscheduled landing in the United Kingdom due to a crack in the aircraft windshield. The plane landed based on standard procedures, and everyone on board, including Secretary Hegseth, is safe. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth is in Brussels today. He said that commitments from NATO countries will translate into enhanced firepower. Here he is.
Firepower. That's what is coming. We expect it is coming from NATO. And it was a historic summit just a couple of months ago, brought about by leadership of President Trump to say we need our allies to step up. And they did, and they have in those commitments. Now those commitments will soon translate into capabilities, which is the most important aspect of it. And one part of that, of course, is Pearl, is the initiative where European countries buy U.S. weapons, transfer to NATO for the fight in Ukraine to bring peace to that conflict. And if there's anything we've learned under President Trump, is the active application of peace through strength.
Hegseth said that strength doesn't mean using strong words or wagging your finger. The War Secretary remarked that you achieve peace by having strong and real capabilities that adversaries respect. Today's meeting of NATO defense ministers aims to boost military support for Ukraine. As new data shows, Western aid has fallen by 43% in recent months. NATO Secretary Mark Rutte said continued support deters Russian aggression. His remarks come amid rising tensions from drone incursions and Russian airspace violations. Defense ministers also discussed lifting restrictions on NATO equipment to better defend the alliance's eastern borders. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth says the U.S. will impose costs on Russia if the Ukraine war doesn't end soon. He made the remarks at a meeting of NATO defense ministers earlier today. NTD's international correspondent Arian Pasdar has the highlights.
If there is no path to peace in the short term, then the United States, along with our allies, will take the steps necessary to impose costs on Russia for its continued aggression.
Secretary of War Pete Hegseth advises Russia to end the fighting in Ukraine. Otherwise, the U.S. will impose costs on Moscow. He says the War Department is ready to do its part in ways only the United States can. He made the remarks at a meeting of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group of Kiev's allies at NATO headquarters on Wednesday.
All countries need to translate goals into guns, commitments into capabilities, and pledges into power. That's all that matters, hard power. It's the only thing belligerents actually respect.
He added that the U.S. is willing to deliver more weapons to NATO member countries. Hegseth urged allies to ramp up investments in the prioritized Ukraine Requirements List program. This replaced U.S. weapons donations to Ukraine and now requires allies to pay for U.S. weapons deliveries. And Wednesday's meetings aren't only about Ukraine. NATO members Germany, Belgium, Poland, Estonia and Romania all report recent airspace violations. Some of them directly blame Russia.
NATO will implement a number of additional counter-drone measures that will build on and expand and accelerate our ability to counter drones.
NATO and EU member states recently agreed to build a so-called drone wall, which would detect and destroy incoming Russian drones. Germany on Wednesday announced that it will allocate over $11 billion in drones and also strongly support the drone wall.
NATO Chief Mark Rutte has presented a plan to strengthen drone defense. In light of recent incidents, this can only be welcomed. Germany will, of course, also make a visible contribution here.
The German defense minister added that Berlin will deploy 2 Eurofighter jets in Poland from December to March to patrol airspace. Arian Pasdar, NTD News.
Today in Washington, Supreme Court justices are weighing race-based redistricting. Oral arguments are underway in the case focused on Louisiana. The ruling could have ripple effects for several other states that plan to redraw their lines. or have already done so. NTD's Melina Weisskopf was in front of the court. She tells us what's on the line.
It's a Louisiana-focused case, but the implications could stretch much further than Louisiana. Look, if the justices side with Louisiana, this could enable red states to more easily redraw their lines that could give Republicans a stronger edge in the 2026 midterms. Now, Steph, the crux of the question before the justices today is whether the popular interpretation of the Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is constitutional or not. Now, emotions are high out here. As you see behind me, there's a group of protesters who have been gathering here outside of the court steps since early this morning, and emotions are high for good reason. This argument today is important, Steph. Look, the fact that justices asked the lawyers before the case to come for a second argument in this same case is a rare occasion, and it indicates that justices might be preparing to make a major change to the law here. Now, arguments are still underway right now. I want to listen to what both sides have said before the justices. Listen in.
That race is playing an outsized role in the electoral process in Louisiana. And so the idea that you have to show that a party is the reason for the racially polarized voting would eclipse the entire Section 2 analysis, which is focused on ferreting out and ending race discrimination in the political process.
You said several times that it's playing an outsized role. Is there, what's the proper size? In other words, is that wiggle room we're talking about, or a significant percentage? What is meant by outsized?
So this court has held for a long time, beginning in Shaw and in many cases since, that there's always an awareness of race. There are always racial considerations and even race consciousness in the districting process. What becomes potentially unlawful is when race is the motivating factor.
Embedded within these express targets are racial stereotypes that this court has long criticized. They assume, for example, that a black voter, simply because he is black, must think like other black voters, share the same interests, and prefer the same political candidates. And this stereotyping system has no logical endpoint. We are 40 years removed from Jingles, and yet, according to my friends on the other side, nothing has changed in the voting and housing patterns in Louisiana that require race-based redistricting. These problems are part of why we never wanted to be here in the first place. They have placed states in impossible situations where the only sure demand is more racial discrimination for more decades.
Now, to get into the details a little bit, the deal here is that Louisiana initially had one black majority district. Then it was ordered by a lower court to create a second black majority district. Then a group of non-black voters sued to try to reverse this. So that's sort of what's going on in the nitty-gritty of the case. The ruling that justices give here will determine whether Louisiana can keep its current map as is with the two black majority districts or has to redraw these maps. And that could endanger possibly the Democrat incumbent Cleo Fields. But of course, we know there are more than 20 other black majority districts across the nation that could also be impacted by this case. And we know that, of course, Republicans have a very slim majority in Congress. So any of these changes could lead to Republicans holding on to their majority and even expanding it come 2026. Now, court experts have suggested and predicted that what justices may do here is to rule that race-based redistricting is unconstitutional, but just limit the scope of the order so that the decision's effect will have a limited scope there.
The U.S. Supreme Court heard arguments in Louisiana versus Calais, a gerrymandering case involving Louisiana's congressional map. Joining us to discuss is Bobby Ann Cox, civil rights attorney, fellow at the Brownstone Institute, and legal analyst. So good afternoon, Bobby Ann, to you. This case challenges the legality of Louisiana's creation of a second black majority congressional district. And I understand you actually listened in on the oral arguments. Can you just give us your overall feeling? What stood out to you based on what you heard? Was there any preference at all indicated by the judges on one side or the other?
Well, it did seem for the part of the oral arguments that I listened to, I believe they're still going on now, but it did seem like the justices were asking questions of the attorneys, which indicated, where they thought this case should come out And it seemed to be divided on party line, really. The three liberal justices seemed to be asking questions that were clearly indicating that they felt like, the Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act should stand and remain and was not unconstitutional. Whereas you saw the other six justices, who are the more conservative justices on SCOTUS, they were asking questions of the attorneys that seemed to be more defining on, this is a violation. This Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is a violation of our 14th Amendment and our 15th Amendment of our federal Constitution. So their questions did seem to be falling along party lines, with the six conservative justices leaning more towards the idea that in this particular instance, the Voting Rights Act, Section 2 is a violation of our 14th and 15th Amendments. And, just to be clear, this is the second time the United States Supreme Court is hearing this particular case. They decided not to rule on it last term, although they did hear the case. And they told the attorneys for both sides to come back this session, which is why we're here again today, to come back this session and argue a slightly different point, which is whether or not Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is constitutional, or does it violate the 14th and 15th Amendments. So they purposely pointed to this specific topic, which will have far spread implications depending on which way the justices come down, because this is now talking about an entire section of the Voting Rights Act, which will affect other cases and other states.
So can I get your thoughts on whether, the counter-argument, whether Section 2 protect minority voters from having their voting power reduced?
Yes. So the intent of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is to basically protect all Americans with their right to vote. And it says that you can't discriminate against somebody because of their either their ethnic origin, or they belong to a certain ethnic group, for example, Italian Americans or Chinese Americans or something like this. So the intent of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is to make sure that, hey, we want everyone, all Americans, to be able to have proper access to the polls. And we also want them to have their vote count. So it basically is a provision put in this law to protect you, no matter what your ethnic origin is or the color of your skin. The problem lies with the fact that how you interpret that and how you apply that language in Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act can, in fact, be a violation of the 14th and 15th Amendments of our federal Constitution, which say, in essence, the 14th Amendment says that everybody has equal rights, equal protections under our laws. So you can't discriminate and apply our laws differently to different people just because of your ethnicity, your national origin, or the color of your skin. And then the 15th Amendment says, in essence, that you can't discriminate against somebody, with the right to vote because of their skin color or their ethnicity or their national origin, in essence, right? So I'm paraphrasing these two amendments to our Constitution. So the Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act comes in direct conflict with, for example, the 15th Amendment of our Constitution, which says, well, you can't discriminate based on someone's, let's say, in this instance of this case in Louisiana, their skin color. But then Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act says, well, we want to protect you so that your skin color does matter, right? So it's a very fine line between Section 2 language of the Voting Rights Act and our 14th and 15th Amendments. And I think the way that Section 2 language has been interpreted in some of these cases is indeed a violation of the voting right. Is indeed a violation of the 14th and 15th Amendment of our federal Constitution. So this is a very interesting and very important case. And we'll see how SCOTUS comes down on this, but it can definitely have far-reaching repercussions.
So I understand your points, but if we look historically, have courts, allowed race to be a factor in drawing districts?
So race is not supposed to be the sole factor. It's not supposed to be the only reason that you draw a congressional district. It can be taken into account, is what the law says, but it's not supposed to be the only thing that is looked at when you draw a congressional district, because that would indeed, undoubtedly, be a violation of our Constitution. So courts in the past have allowed race to be one of the factors that are taken into account when these congressional lines are drawn in the states. It doesn't matter what state it is. But again, fine line here, because race can't be the only thing they look at. Otherwise, that is unconstitutional. It would be discrimination, whether your skin is white or black or some color in between. You're not allowed to have that as the main focus or the only focus of why you're drawing a district. So yes, it's definitely a fine line, and there's a lot of gray area. How much has a court, in a court decision, how much have they allowed race to be an element of determination in how that district was drawn? Right? It's a very gray area. There's not a straight line in the sand that says, once you cross this line, you are now all of a sudden using race as the main issue or the main determining factor in how you draw those lines. So it is a gray area, and it's not something that's black and white.
Okay, I think you explained it pretty clearly here. I'll just ask you one more question. And Bobby Ann, I was looking into this a bit earlier today, and I found that we've seen cases like Allen versus Milligan, right, where the court upheld Section 2. So is Louisiana versus Calais similar or different from that case?
Yeah, it is slightly different. And here's the issue. This is actually one of the points that they were arguing during oral arguments earlier this afternoon that I was listening to. And it is a different case. The facts were different in that case. And the problem is that, as I said earlier, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, the language can be interpreted by courts across the country and differently. And it can be applied differently by the courts across the country, depending on how they're interpreting that language. So, as I said, if you take Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, and under Milligan, the Supreme Court did not decide in that case whether or not Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is on its face, meaning the plain language of Section 2, is unconstitutional, is a violation of Amendment 14 or the 15th Amendment of the United States Constitution. They did not decide that in the essence or in the circumstances of this language being applied to the gerrymandering or trying to avoid the gerrymandering of lines, or congressional lines. So the cases are different, and this has not yet been decided by the United States Supreme Court. And I hope that they do decide this, because they asked for this one issue to be decided. They asked the attorneys to come back. They asked them to do briefings specifically on this point. They asked them to come back and re-argue this case specifically on this point in this session. So I do think we're going to get a ruling from them on this point in this session. And it's going to be extremely important, because what they decide here, if they say that Section 2 of the 1965 Voting Rights Act is unconstitutional on its face, and they strike it down. Now, I don't think that's what's going to happen. I think perhaps a certain provision within Section 2 might be struck down, but I don't think they're going to take the entire Section 2 out of the Voting Rights Act. But this is an extremely important case, because if they do say that part of Section 2 is a violation of the 14th or 15th Amendment of the Constitution, then that's now going to open the door to other districts in other states being redrawn. And as you know, the congressional races that are coming up in 2026 affect the whole country. So who wins in what state does affect the balance of the whole country.
Yeah, it looks like, seems like the impact could be wide-ranging. It's always great to talk to you, and we'll be following this, Bobby Ann, sorry. We'll be following this very closely, and pleasure to speak with you today. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Senate Republicans have shifted their strategy to reopen the government and will now pursue full-year appropriation bills in order to end the shutdown. Our Washington correspondent, Luis Eduardo Martinez, has more on the Republicans' new approach.
Today, if it weren't for the bold leadership of President Trump helping us to protect our military, everyone needs to understand that 1.3 million active duty service members would be missing a paycheck. They'll get their check, thankfully, because President Trump has shown strong leadership.
The Trump administration has reallocated $8 billion of unused research and development funds from the Department of War to pay active duty service members during the government shutdown. Senate Republicans have now teed up a vote for this Thursday on the House-passed defense appropriation bill to try and secure annual funding for the Department of War during the government shutdown.
Republicans want to pay the troops, and we have shown that with our actions and our votes now 9 times. And the Democrats want to use them as hostages to extort $1.5 trillion in new, unserious partisan spending that we just won't go along with.
The new Republican strategy in Congress is to continue the regular appropriations process despite Democrats' intransigence to reopen the government. Democrats, on the other hand, insist on their messaging and demanding that their policy priorities be met in order to reopen government.
We are ready, we are willing, and we are able to negotiate a bipartisan spending agreement that actually meets the needs of the American people. Reopen the government and decisively address the Republican health care crisis.
The Senate has already, on a bipartisan basis, passed 3 out of the 12 appropriations bills and is prepared to vote on a 4th one this Thursday.
Mr. President, Democrats attempt to defend their funding blockade by complaining that Republicans won't negotiate. But what exactly is there to negotiate? Negotiation happens when you have 2 sides, each with its own demands. Republicans have no demands.
The vote on the defense appropriations bill this Thursday also served as a pressure point on moderate Democrats who have already said they want to see the regular appropriations process play out to fund government. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Luis Eduardo Martinez, NTD News.
President Trump signed a memo to pay active members of the military for their service during the government shutdown. Active duty military personnel are scheduled to receive paychecks today. Trump's memo is intended to bridge the gap until the government reopens. The funds used for military pay and allowances will come from funds already appropriated by Congress and still available from the 2026 fiscal year. And President Trump says a list will be released soon of Democrat-backed programs that will be cut. Joining us to discuss is George Carrillo, former Democratic candidate for governor of Oregon, and we have Matt Klink, Republican strategist and political analyst. Good afternoon to you. Good to have you both here. George, I'll start with you. So what programs exactly could the president be talking about here?
Well, I think the president's probably going to continue his path on defunding the education system. We'll probably see a cutoff from infrastructure on green energy projects throughout the country. I think he'll also continue to look at subsidies right now because of the shutdown and holding strong on not continuing those subsidies. I also think that he is going to try to put more money in what he says are successful programs for Republicans, which I think it'll probably be, he'll want to invest into law enforcement and also into more border security and deportation tactics.
So, Matt, what are your thoughts here? President Trump framing some of these programs as, semi-communist or socialist. Your thoughts?
Well, look, yeah, there were a lot of programs that the Democratic infrastructure and deep Washington D.C. has funded for generations that, frankly, had no particular benefit to the broader American public, but they did fund Democrat-specific priorities. I will find it ironic that funding tougher law enforcement, that's not a Republican priority, that's an American priority. But aside from that, Donald Trump, because again, as Barack Obama said, elections have consequences. Donald Trump is going to make it hurt, particularly for Democrats. I will add, though, that Donald Trump is going to get the troops paid today on the 15th. And ironically enough, again, Trump is a master at this. You have the Democrats arguing that Donald Trump couldn't do that. So again, to take an issue, an 80-20 issue, the Republicans take the 80, the Democrats get the 20. They're arguing against paying the troops. So look, the Republicans just want to reopen the government. Have passed a clean continuing resolution, something that the Democrats have done 13 times under Joe Biden. They're not pushing any new policy proposals in this clean CR proposal. And Chuck Schumer, because he fears a run from his left by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, is keeping the government closed. And he's not going to be able to hold the American people hostage.
So, George, can I get a response to what you heard Matt said? And how do you feel about the framing of President Trump for these programs as semi-communist or socialist?
So I think it's humorous because one is the fact that Republicans have control of the White House and Congress, both the House and the Senate. We are the minority, and we're standing strong right now in order to be able to protect healthcare for millions of people. And Republicans, their backup is against the wall right now with this government shutdown. They're going to have to own it. There's too many Americans that are going to see an increase in their healthcare premiums, and they're not going to be insurable. And so right now, Republicans continue to lie about the reasons why this government shutdown is happening. If they really want to open up the government, then they need to learn to have some sort of bipartisan conversation and not just have meetings within their own caucus and passing bills without any sort of Democratic support. So right now, it's really on the Republicans. They're going to own it, and they're going to feel it in the midterms.
So, Matt, can I get a response from you? So George mentioned bipartisan negotiations, right? How do you respond to a talking point from the Democratic side that this continuing resolution has no Democratic input?
Well, actually, first of all, it does have Democratic votes. It got Democratic votes in the United States Senate. And as Democratic talking point in Georgia, because of the Senate rules that require 60 votes, we need 8 Senate Democrats to vote affirmatively. We have 4 right now. So eventually, as the pressure builds on the Schumer shutdown, ultimately the Democrats are going to come back to the table with their tail between their legs and they'll reopen the government. All the Republicans are saying is let's open the government and then we can have as many conversations on health care. I really am looking forward to one, illegal immigrants in the healthcare bill, and two is that during COVID, with the bipartisanship that George just mentioned, the Democrats passed temporary increases to Obamacare. They now want to extend those temporary increases and make them permanent. Only in Washington, temporary spending increase a permanent spending increase. And the Republicans are just saying, we can even have that conversation. But let's open.
All right, Matt, you were actually breaking up a little bit just now, so I'll go to George here.
Okay.
We heard bits and pieces of what you said, but some of it we were lost due to the connection. So, George, do you think the cuts are necessary right now due to the shutdown?
So I think what needs to happen is Republicans need to show some good faith here. every time we try to negotiate when we don't have any control, they go back on their word. They push bills that are not good for the American people. And right now with Democrats, they're saying no. They're drawing a line in the sand, and they're saying we're not going to see millions of Americans lose their health care coverage. And right now it is on the House and the Senate to reconvene, find a way to be able to negotiate and figure out right now, how can we provide a temporary solution before we can have the longer conversation of these subsidies, of how we can create a policy that is not going to devastate Americans throughout this country. And understand that it is a domino effect. When you affect people's accessibility to healthcare, that hurts the US economy. It hurts consumer spending. So we really need to be able to take a look at this and say, okay, let's open up the government. Let's find some common ground. Let's get a bill that is passable. But right now, with the way Republicans are behaving, they're not willing to have conversations. They're putting lawmakers on recess while there's still workers right now, like TSA and air traffic controllers. They're expected to show up and they're not getting paid, but yet our lawmakers are, and yet they're not in session.
So, George, House Minority Leader Jeffries says he agrees with making sure that uniform active duty troops are paid, but House Speaker Mike Johnson accused Democrats of voting 8 times to block their paychecks. He was referring to their votes on the stopgap bill, which would fund the government to a pre-shutdown level. Your response to that?
So I think, again, it's a bunch of smoking mirrors. They're not telling the whole story. The bill is not all about just the paying the troops. I don't believe that Democrats don't want to pay the troops, but we also want to ensure that subsidies are being paid for. There's a reason why we are trying to prevent this bill from passing it in the way that it's current in its current state. And so it's easy for Republicans to change the narrative. Just like when they first came out saying Democrats were all about providing these subsidies for undocumented immigrants, which is completely not true. Undocumented immigrants do not qualify for subsidies, nor do they qualify for Medicaid. And so they're consistently gaslighting the American people on what Democrats are actually trying to do. And Democrats right now are actually working for American families, for middle and low income members throughout the United States that can't afford quality health care. And again, is that what the Republican Party wants to do? They want to eliminate these subsidies to take away accessibility for people's health? Is that what we've come to?
So, George, Matt is actually fixing his connection. In the meantime, do you think that this is the same continuing resolution that Democrats have voted in the past?
Well, Democrats want to be able to see that. So let's go back to like social programs like SNAP and WIC benefits, subsidies for Medicare. These are helping people that don't necessarily have the means, that provides sort of a bridge to be able to help people become more self-sufficient, be able to receive the quality of care that they need. No child, no person should go hungry at night. No one should not receive services, medical services, simply because we draw this political line. That's not what America is about, and that's what we're doing right now. We're politicizing what's in the best interest of the American people right now, and all we're doing is finger pointing. And so right now, remember, Democrats do not have control of the House and the Senate. They're using the power that they have in order to provide a negotiation tactic, and Republicans are not showing up to have those conversations.
Okay, George, I'll ask you one more thing and then I'll go to Matt. I think he's back now. He raised a point earlier and I would like your response. Why not to open the government and then we can talk about healthcare or debate about anything once federal employees are being paid?
Because then it's going to be too late. Then what's going to happen? There's going to be millions of Americans that are going to see their premiums or not getting this that they need. We're going to see loss of life because of that, because of those choices. And Republicans have proven that they don't want to work with Democrats. They want to pass what it is that they want to pass, and they don't necessarily compromise with Democrats. So why would we believe that they are willing to do the right thing after we open up the government?
Okay, so Matt, I think you heard what George said, right? Can you give us a response?
Yeah. Well, Look, the subsidies, first of all, the subsidies that they pass tend to go toward middle and upper income voters. Again, this is just a pure government handouts that the Democrats desperately want to expand Obamacare to more and more Americans. The way to do this, if they want to do this, is let's have a straight up or down vote. Don't hold the American people hostage by shutting down the government, and certainly don't do money to people who are in this country illegally and no legitimate claim to receiving taxpayer benefits. Period. End of subject. The Schumer shutdown is holding the American people hostage, and the American public will take it out on the Democrats in 2026.
Okay, Matt, I'll just give you one more question here. So George was saying that if we open the government, then it would be too late because I'm paraphrasing here. It seems like Republicans don't want to work with Democrats.
Well, that's a good Democratic talking point, and it's ironic given that the massive spending that occurred when Joe Biden was in office was a strict party line vote. No, look, we have bipartisan support here. There are 4 Democratic senators who voted for a clean continuing resolution. And George just doesn't want to acknowledge. He would rather let the most radical progressive left in the Democratic Party hold this country hostage. And look, the Republicans aren't going to believe it. The voting public is not going to believe it. And it's going to help the Republicans in 2026 because they will see how extreme the Democrats are. They would rather fund health care for people who are here illegally, not pay our armed forces, cut crime, funding, all because they want to fund their radical groups like Antifa. This is straight out of the Democratic progressive playbook, and the American public sees through it.
Okay, we just have about maybe 30 seconds here. George, if you have any final thoughts you'd like to share, and then we can leave the conversation there.
Sure. It's not about being radical. It's not about a left-leaning agenda. It's about American taxpayers. It's about subsidies for Medicare. And the lies, the continuation of undocumented immigrants, again, they don't qualify. This is not about undocumented immigrants. This is about low to middle income families. These subsidies will help them to be able to have accessibility. And so all of this rhetoric, this is about the health and safety of the American people. And that's what it comes down to.
All right, I think we can leave the conversation there. I'm sure more can be said, but thank you both for coming on today.
Thanks a million.
It's now a good time to invest in gold. With gold prices at a record high, NTD Sean Marshall spoke with some gold dealers in Manhattan's Diamond District about how business is going. We have that story and more after this break.